Yes? Okay. So I'm interested in the phonological realization of new information or focus, and as the title pointed out, on the use of focal pitch accents. And you all know the TOBI systems that were proposed following the Oro-Semental metrical framework, and you know that these systems are language specific. So the same pitch category, for example, rising pitch accent is used both in Dutch and in Greek, but the phonetic realization is different. So we find later peaks in Greek than in Dutch. This language specificity poses a challenge also for the study of the L2 acquisition of intonational grammars. So for my study, I'm looking at the intonational realization of subjects in different focus conditions, specifically considering the use of low plus high star, and I'm comparing American English and Peninsular Spanish, and looking at the acquisition of this pitch accent by native speakers of American English learning Spanish, both in the US with little experience abroad and abroad exposed to the target language and immersed in it. So we can distinguish different types of focus considering the extension of the focus constituent. We can have broad focus, as in the answer to the question, what happened? Or in the answer to the question, what did Mariana do? And also narrow focus if only one constituent introduces new information, for example, who made the marmalade? That would be informational focus, or contrastive or corrective focus in the answer to the question, Rosanna made the marmalade? And there are no direct comparisons between American English and Peninsular Spanish, but we know of the categories that have been proposed for both varieties. So for broad focus, in English we find high star, high monotone. I don't know if the sound is working.
Mariana made the marmalade.
No. I wouldn't, you know how it sounds? I'm an L2 speaker, so probably wouldn't sound right. But in Spanish we have low plus delayed high star, so a rising pitch accent with a late peak. Mariana hizo la mermelada. For informational subject focus, we also have high star in American English, whereas in Spanish we have low plus high star. Mariana hizo la mermelada. And then for contrastive focus in English, the use of low plus high star was proposed, although there's some controversy, and the use of high star has also been reported in this context. And for Spanish, we find as well low plus high star as we did with informational focus. So Mariana hizo la mermelada. So we have all these different pitch categories, and we can propose differences based on the phonetic realization. So high star would differ from low plus high star in terms of pitch range. We would find a wider pitch range in low plus high star, and low plus high star differs from low plus delayed high star in terms of alignment. So for low plus delayed high star, we find later peaks realized in the post-tonic. As I said, there are no comparisons between American English and Peninsular Spanish. Garcia Lecumberri compared British English and Peninsular Spanish, and she found that British English speakers produce this focal pitch accent low plus high star with an expanded pitch range compared to speakers of Peninsular Spanish. This category low plus high star doesn't reflect this difference. We could do a narrower phonetic transcription following Walden Prieto's proposal, and we could suggest that the British realization would be like low plus upstate high star, whereas the Peninsular Spanish one would be low plus high star. Regarding the L2 acquisition of intonation, specifically the realization of focus, some evidence points towards the role of transfer. There's evidence from native speakers of Spanish learning English that shows that they use a narrower pitch range. It would be explained because a narrower pitch range is used in Spanish. And the other way around, native English speakers learning Spanish use a wider pitch range in their Spanish as a result of transfer from the L1. However, there are also evidence for universal tendencies in the acquisition of intonation. One finding is that learners fail to mark the distinction between given and new information. Another one is that learners tend to use a narrower pitch range in their L2, even when their L1 is characterized by the use of a wide pitch range. Another finding is that that phonological categories are acquired before the phonetic implementation of them. So for my studies, my goals are to combine a phonological and a phonetic approach, which will help me pinpoint the cross-linguistic differences and also give more detailed explanations about what is happening in the L2 grammar. I also want to explore what's the role of transfer and these universal parents, and consider the role of exposure to the target language abroad. So for my first research question, I asked whether native speakers of American English learning Spanish use low plus high star to mark narrow focus on the subjects. If transfer happens, then they will use this. If they use low plus high star in their English, they will transfer the use of this category to Spanish, mostly to contrastive focus, but possibly also to informational focus. However, they may also fail to mark the distinction between all these focus conditions following this universal pattern that has been also reported in previous studies. For my second research question, I'm interested in the phonetic implementation of low plus high star, and I wanted to see if transfer from the L1 happens. If they use a wider pitch range in their L1 and transfer occurs, they will also produce this low plus high star with an expanded pitch range in their L2 Spanish, when the target in Peninsular Spanish would be phrasing pitch accent with a narrower pitch range. However, we also have this universal pattern for the use of narrower pitch range in the L2, so they could also do that. And finally, considering the role of exposure, I expect learners with more experience abroad to behave more like native speakers and therefore use low plus high star more frequently and produce it within a narrower pitch range, approximating native values. So to test this hypothesis, I designed a contextualized question-answer pairs task. Participants had to pretend they were having a conversation with two old friends from school about their classmates' whereabouts now in the present. So these friends would ask a series of questions that elicited different utterances with different focus conditions. So subject focus, VP focus, and object focus, and both with informational focus and contrastive focus. And the same utterance was elicited with two focus conditions and both in informational and contrastive focus. And I have an English and an Spanish version of the experiment. The names used as the subjects were the same in both versions. They were always paroxytones with a pretonic syllable. And you will see an example in a few slides. I had 4 groups of participants with 12 participants in each group, a group of native speakers of English with no knowledge or little knowledge of other languages, a group of native speakers of Peninsular Spanish from the region of Asturias, a group of learners of Spanish here in the US with very little experience abroad, less than a month, and usually these were trips. And then a group of learners who were abroad at the time they participated in the experiment. They were in the same region where my native speakers were recruited, and they had been there for at least 3 months, and they were immersed. They were living with Spanish-speaking families. They had Spanish-speaking friends. So this is an example of an experimental item eliciting informational focus. So they would see a video. I can play the video. And she would say something like, "Oh,
how nice! Somebody told me that one of our classmates decorated a lamppost. Do you know who?"
Then they could move on to the next slide and see kind of like a fictitious blog where someone posts this information about their classmates. And with this information, they had to answer the question using a full sentence and in the most natural way. Then they were told that these 2 friends wanted to tell all this gossip to someone else, and before that, they wanted to make sure that they got all the information right. So they produced declaratives like this one: Paloma decorated a lamppost. There was always something wrong. They were able to look again at the post from this blog and correct the information using a full sentence again. The experiment was presented on a PowerPoint, and it was performed in a quiet lab environment using a recorder and a condenser microphone. For the learners, they did it in 2 different sessions. They did it first in Spanish and then in English. And a few days in between. It wasn't done on the same day. For the analysis, I took 6 utterances in these 3 focus conditions, the same utterance in broad focus condition, and the informational subject focus and contrastive subject focus. And these were annotated using RAP. So I had a tier for the fonts, a tier for words or orthographic transcription. Then I also extracted values for duration, so I marked syllable boundaries for the subject, In the fourth tier, I mark the lowest, or the minimum F0 and the maximum F0 within the tonal movement realized on the subject. And then I also had a TOBI transcription. For the analysis today, I'm reporting results from a quantitative analysis using generalized additive mixed models with speaker as a random intercept, and also results from a qualitative analysis looking at individual differences. So these are the results for the pitch accents that were found. You have Spanish on the bottom and English on the top. For broad focus in Spanish, the target pitch accent, the one that was produced mostly by native speakers, was low plus delayed high star. Learners were producing that pitch accent, but they weren't doing it as frequently as native speakers of Spanish. So they were not as native-like in that case. For informational focus, the target pitch accent was low plus high star. That's what native speakers were producing. And although learners were producing it, they weren't doing it as frequently as native speakers. They were actually using the low plus delayed high star that is usually found in broad focus. And then for contrastive focus, again, the target for Peninsular Spanish speakers is low plus high star, and learners were producing it as frequently as native speakers. There were no significant differences between them. So in this condition, they were more native-like. If you see the results from English, we see that for both narrow focus conditions, there's alternation between the use of high star and low plus high star. If we look at the individual results, this is for informational focus, what learners did. We can see that learners who produce low plus high star in their English continued to use that in the Spanish. So they transferred the use of low plus high star into their Spanish. And there were also some learners who didn't produce low plus high star in their English, but they did so in their Spanish. So they added this category to their inventories. Again, for contrastive focus, we also see that those learners who produce low plus high star transfer the use of low plus high star to the Spanish, and there were more learners who didn't use low plus high star in their English, but they incorporated this category to their Spanish. And we see that this happens both for learners abroad and learners in the US. There's no difference based on exposure. Now, considering the phonetic implementation of these two pitch accents that were mostly found in the data, we can see that they differ from each other based on pitch range. So low plus high star displayed wider pitch range values than high star. However, there were no significant differences between the realization of low plus high star in English and Spanish in terms of pitch range. However, we do see qualitatively that the values for low plus high star are kind of in between the values that we find for high star and low plus high star in English. But this is mainly due to individual variation. So if we look at the results from learners, and this is only plotting the results from learners who produce low plus high star both in their English and in their Spanish, we see that there are some learners who produce this pitch accent with an expanded pitch range both in their English and in their Spanish. And there's only one who uses a wider pitch range in English than in Spanish. So I had some examples for you from a native speaker at the top and for learner abroad at the bottom. And in this case, you see an expanded pitch range actually in Spanish, but the intonational contour is similar in English and in Spanish for this learner. So going back to my predictions, in terms of the use of low plus high star to mark narrow focus on the subject, there was transfer in cases of contrastive subject focus. However, for informational subject focus, there was evidence more for this universal parent to fail to mark this type of focus. So this supports the idea that phonological categories are acquired early, but we also have to consider factors such as markedness. So prosodic marking of informational focus is more marked than prosodic marking of contrastive focus, and therefore is more difficult to be acquired. So that's one possible explanation for why this was found. In terms of the phonetic implementation of low plus high star, I didn't find a difference between American English and Peninsular Spanish, but I did find evidence of transfer because learners were producing the same pitch range values in their English and in their Spanish. So I didn't find this evidence for this pattern of using a narrower pitch range, but there were individual differences. And with respect to the differences based on experience abroad, there were no differences between them. Mainly, we have individual differences. So not necessarily exposure abroad will help you develop your intonational grammar. There must be other factors. So for ideas for discussion in future steps, I didn't find this contrast between high star and low plus high star that was proposed, and this has been shown in previous literature. This is controversial, but I think it was interesting to see that those learners who did use low plus high star in their English transferred that to their Spanish. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I also show that it's beneficial to use a phonetic approach to study the acquisition of intonational grammars and to identify individual differences. And variability across speakers was found both for the phonological and the phonetic analysis, and this is also common in studies on the acquisition of intonation in study abroad context. Ideas for future step, it would be important to look at what happens at the initial stages. These learners were intermediate, but we don't know much about what happens before, for example, they go abroad, or when they first start to learn Spanish, if transfer is more pervasive there, or if we find more evidence of these universal patterns. Another way to look at it would be to do a longitudinal or cross-sectional study. And I think it's very important to include analysis of individual factors and also to explore the role of instruction. It would be also interesting to look at other language parents. So for example, to look at a language that uses a completely different pitch accent to mark narrow focus and see what happens when they acquire a language that uses a different pitch accent. To conclude, I've shown that for the study of the L2 acquisition of intonational grammars, transfer and universal patterns both constrain the development, and we can benefit from an approach that considers both phonological and phonetic analysis. That's it.
Hi, so I was wondering about the differences between the two L2 speakers. Oh, by the way, my name is Nuria Martinez, University of Cologne. So you talked about a difference in stay. So the speakers in Spain had been there for 3 months or longer.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you also took into account other factors, such as, for example, the level of Spanish that they already had.
So I have some measurements of proficiency. I didn't include them in this analysis, and I'm going to. I don't think grammatical proficiency or accuracy would be very determinant, but yeah, it's really important to look at all these different measures of proficiency. Yeah.
Hi, Nicole Holiday, Pomona College. Thank you, this is very interesting work. So I have some recent work with Rachel Burdine and Paul Reed where we've compared the realization of the L plus H star pitch accent in varieties of American English and found both differences in rate of use and realization of the pitch accent across ethno-linguistic and regional varieties. So I wonder, with your English speakers, it seems like they have different levels of baseline use of L plus H star in English, which may affect their Spanish, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And the other thing is, in the realizational differences, we didn't only find pitch range, we also found slope. So it's about, there's something about the relationship between time and F0 that seems to really make a difference when you see variation in the use of this pitch accent.
So you wanted me to say more about
the differences between their English use of L plus H star and then their Spanish. So they have a baseline English level, and then how does that affect what they're doing in Spanish?
So what I found is that those who use low plus high star in their English, they also use it in their Spanish. And some who don't use it in their English incorporate its use to Spanish. But I don't have any information on why some did use it in their English. They were all from this area, from Massachusetts. I don't know if that is interesting, but yeah, I'm very curious about that.
Hi, is this gone? Yeah. Jennifer Arnold, UNC. So thanks, this is really interesting.
Thanks.
I have first a clarification question and then maybe a comment. Did I remember correctly that you had them all do the Spanish version of this first and then the English a few days later?
Yeah.
So I really wonder what the order of doing that could be doing to task performance, right? So how much is, this task measuring the way they use language or what they know about their language or their habitual patterns? How much is this just how they happen to perform on the task at that moment in time, and could that be influenced by experience with the task? And so, if you're ever going to do this again, you really ought to counterbalance it.
Yeah.
And in particular, I wonder if this might be what's going on with your finding that all the Spanish speakers were using the low plus H star, or not Spanish speakers, when they're doing the task in Spanish, you're getting low plus H star all over the place, right?
For learners?
Well, maybe I'm misremembering the graph. So you had a lot of L plus H, yeah, there, look, it's all green on the bottom.
Yes.
And there's a lot of blue on the top. And
yes.
So what this means is that, I don't know if you can conclude that this is transfer per se.
Right.
It just means people are using L plus H star a lot in Spanish, and they're not using it as much in English. And so another way of saying this is that after they've gotten used to the task, they're relaxing, they're not putting as much effort into it, they're not doing as much prosodically, so they're just kind of, being more neutral in their prosody.
Because they already knew the information.
Well, because they did the task already, and so they're maybe trying less hard. This is speculative, we don't know if that's what's happening, but it's a possibility.
Yeah.
One way to look for that is you could look for changes over the course of the task and see, first half, second half, are you going to see any changes in the same direction, even within the Spanish? And if you do, certainly that would be a signal that you should look further at this, but either way, it'd be really great to do it with this counterbalance to see if that has any effect.
You're right, thank you.
Hi, Rachel Burdine. Just a quick question about your alignment measure. Was that normalized in any way for speaking rate?
Well, I didn't report any results on alignment, but I did normalize it for my dissertation. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Christian DeCanio, University of Buffalo. There's a couple ways to mark focus in Spanish. So you could also say, lo hizo Mariana. And Mariana is final, and then that's marked as narrow focus too. But in a reading task, that's being constrained. So it's always going to be before the verb. Is there a difference in the pattern that's observed on the basis of where the constituent under question occurs in the sentence?
Internationally? Yeah. So if it's placed at the end, it will have a different, we can actually find low plus high star, high plus low star, or low star in final position when the subject is placed there.
And so I guess one sort of follow-up for me then is the larger pitch range a product of the fact that it's ensuring that the focused element has to be initial when it might normally be final? I don't know what the more typical pattern is in Peninsular Spanish.
Well, there's controversy about that too.
Okay.
But the idea is that in Spanish you will always find these rising pitch accents in prenuclear position, and with differences in alignment you mark the narrow focus. So you will always have a wide pitch range in prenuclear position, yeah. Okay.
Alluded at the end briefly
Mhm.
comment briefly on that. So if the goal is to, acquire the institutional knowledge of
Mhm.
the language, have you looked into any ways people teach that? 'Cause I know prosody often isn't as focused on second language learning.
Mhm. So, for example, Estebas, Vilaplana, and Ramirez Verdugo are using it in England, and they are actually trying to use Toby labels. The idea would be that the Toby labels, you have something to look at, like a representation of what the tonal movement should look like, and for learners to also be able to categorize what they should be producing.
So they graphically represent it.
Yeah.